Okay, yeah, sip. Test. Okay, so welcome to the fifth panel discussion on human and environmental welfare. So thank you for staying. I know it's a little bit late today, but we have several panelists that will discuss very interesting subjects. So without further ado, because I know that you've been waiting, I will just give a short introduction to our speakers. So we have 4 speakers today. Our first speaker is Professor Frank Giorgio, who is a professor of environmental economics and climate change economics at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, and he's also the director at the Center for Climate and Energy Policy. And then our second speaker is Dr. Desi Adaryani from the Faculty of Economics and Business, and also the head of the research cluster and also the director of the graduate program in accounting. And then the third one we have Dr. Frank Vollmer, who is a researcher at OPHI and also the lecturer in development economics at the University Jaume I, Spain. And our last speaker for today is Dr. Herizo, who is the conservation practitioner from Madagascar. And he holds a PhD from University of Oxford, where he studied the social and biodiversity impacts on community-based conservation projects in Madagascar. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, our session today will talk about how, and then to what extent, and the importance of taking the environmental issues into account in micro and microeconomics policy. And we are going to talk about, our first speaker, Dr. Frank, will talk about how we integrate these environmental issues, these global warming issues into policies. And then our second speaker, Dr. Desi, will talk about more about corporate sectors, how they measure these environmental impacts. And then our last 2 speakers, Dr. Frank Vollmer and Dr. Herizo, will talk about how the MPI also integrate these environmental factors. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our first speaker for today, Dr. Frank. Are you there?
Yes, I am, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And unusual to have 2 speakers named Frank in one session. Very good. Look, I hope, of course, even with this delay, that we will still have time towards the end of the session to enter a question and answer session and a panel discussion. And I will certainly endeavor to keep within the agreed time limit for my short talk. So, look, my area of work, of research and policy engagement is energy transition towards a low-carbon economy, climate change policy, economic policy, and economics. My field is economics, very much applied in the policy context. And really, climate change and energy is the area of microeconomic endeavor that I will speak about with regard to poverty aspects, of course. And so, if you permit, I will share some slides. They're essentially my notes for this short talk as well, and so that will make it easier, I think, to follow my argument. So Really, the key points I want to make are threefold. First of all, climate change will have adverse effect on many, many people and groups, really in most countries of the world, and it will particularly strongly affect poorer people in society, and hence policy to adapt to the impacts of climate change really needs to take care of protecting the poor and vulnerable in society. And on each of these points, I will delve a little deeper. Point is that the low emissions energy transition ultimately will bring very low cost energy, and that will be of great benefit, of course, also for poverty alleviation. But in the transition, there will be very high investment costs, and so that has important implications as to how governments go about the regulatory policy and market frameworks to enable that energy transition towards zero emissions energy sources. And that's of course true in many dimensions. It is also true with regard to poverty alleviation. The third main point I would like to make is with regard to the current energy crisis. I put that in inverted commas because it is of course not the first period of time when energy prices were really high in historical comparison. And the point I want to make there is that policy, of course, needs to be geared towards longer-term energy affordability and needs to be geared towards offsetting adverse effects on cost of living, in particular for the poorer parts of societies right now. And there's some specific do's and don'ts for governments in this that I will come back to in just a few minutes. Now back to climate change and climate change impacts. So, of course, we're already seeing climate change unfold. The recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change summarizes the state of knowledge about this very well, and the judgment is unambiguous. We are already seeing the impacts of climate change. They're very largely negative impacts, in some cases dramatically bad impacts, and these impacts will accelerate and deepen over time. And so some impacts that are important, in particular in the development context, are of course on agriculture, on coastal zones, with flooding, on cities, on health, etc., etc. The list goes on. Now, the poor in any society tend to be most affected by climate change impacts. And the reason for that really is twofold. First of all, the poor tend to experience the climate change impacts more strongly. They tend to be more in the way of climate change. So just think, for example, of small-scale farming, which may in future suffer from too much rainfall at the wrong time of year, or from droughts, for example. Urban flooding, of course, is also something that tends to affect those parts of cities where the poor are concentrated. The second point is that the poor are, of course, by and large less able to cope, because coping with such physical impacts usually requires economic and financial resources. Okay? The poor also tend to have less access to credit, to education, to health services, and so forth. And so out of that arises a very clear need for governments and societal institutions more broadly to focus on poverty in responding to climate change. And so that needs to be seen as part and parcel of general development policies, right? So it needs to be a mainstreaming of climate change concerns into development. And it needs to encompass targeted support to help poor groups in society deal with climatic change, right? And that can take the form, for example, of support for relocation. For example, thinking of our small-scale farmers, agricultural diversification, right? Providing, for example, credit for farmers to change their growing practices. It can also be things that are as straightforward as flood-proofing of housing to the extent that can be possible, investment in infrastructure that insulates poorer segments of society from climatic impacts and so forth. Onwards to my second point, and that is on the energy transition towards low-carbon energy and industrial systems. That transition is getting underway, and we can see in broad outlines how it will go. And what it means is enormously large investments in the energy systems of the future, which are by and large not fossil fuel-based, but renewable energy-based. The future of that is a very bright one, because the localized, renewable energy-based energy systems of the future will have very low maintenance costs, very low running costs, because in contrast to the current coal, oil and gas-fired systems, they will not require the provision of an ongoing flow of fuel, right, which is a large part of the cost of our current energy systems. All they require, by and large, is the upfront investment cost. Right? And of course, that is the task the world over for the next decade, 2 or 3, is to invest in these energy systems of the future. And therein lies the problem. It requires very, very large investment upfront. And so global clean energy investment needs are estimated at 2 to 4 times the current investment flows that we see in those parts of the energy system. And so for developing countries in particular, that means an enormous ramp-up of upfront investment. And so for policy, the implication is that that mechanisms are needed to shield the poor from high energy costs in the transition. How can we do that? In the context of policy mechanisms that may include green banks, that may include carbon pricing, that may include other measures by governments to really help the private sector invest in a very big way in clean energy systems. 3 things come to mind here. First of all, providing income support. So to the extent that market systems result in higher energy prices, governments have the opportunity, of course, governments have the opportunity to subsidize energy prices, right? But that, by and large, is the wrong way to go, because it diminishes the incentives for consumers to save energy and thereby unnecessarily inflates the overall energy costs throughout the economy. So instead, it's much better to go for targeted income support. And of course, Indonesia is one of the standout examples of success of good policy in that area, in terms of the removal of fossil fuel subsidies, which resulted in higher fossil fuel prices, which was accompanied by cash transfers under previous Indonesian governments. Secondly, structuring energy tariffs to protect the poor. And so specifically what I mean by that is, for example, to structure electricity use tariffs in such a way that the first amounts of energy consumed by any household come at a lower price than the subsequent blocks of energy used. So this is a proven and tested strategy to reduce the overall cost of energy to households that use less energy, which tends to correlate very well with income levels and therefore poverty. So in other words, for poverty alleviation, provide a relatively small amount of energy to each and every household at very low prices, and then ramp the price up quite steeply after that. And third, of course, support energy efficiency. Poor households are often the ones that operate at very low energy efficiency because they may not be able to afford the capital investments that result in better energy usage. And so there's a good opportunity for governments to support poor households in upgrading to energy-efficient equipment. Finally, the point about the current energy crisis that we're seeing. So what's happened is that oil prices, gas prices, and coal prices have shot up with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. It's a supply crunch, but it's also the effect of geopolitical uncertainty. Now, over time, it's precisely those high prices that will drive the prices down. So in many markets, the solution to high prices is high prices. And that's, of course, because the high prices mean that there's accelerated investment in alternative supplies, because, of course, you will earn a very handsome profit if you're currently able to supply energy. And it also means a drive of energy efficiency. And a classic example, of course, is the oil crisis in the 1970s. Meanwhile, however, the poor suffer while the corporate sector, or in fact the energy providing corporate sector, gains, right? So really, if you change nothing else but prices, then you see a big transfer of wealth away from consumers and to producers, okay, at the economic basis of this. This is a particular issue, of course, for poor to middle income earners, for whom energy comprises a larger share of overall household expenditure, right? Now, what are policy approaches that are suitable for this? First of all, of course, tax energy producers, and in particular, governments can consider a so-called super profits tax. The United Kingdom is an example where a mechanism like that is currently at work, bringing extra public revenue by basically sharing the additional unusual profits that energy companies have between shareholders and the public, right? That extra tax income can then be used to recycle to energy users, in particular the poor, of course. Where it's possible, this should be done while leaving prices unchanged. Leave those energy prices high, don't meddle too much with market settings in that regard, and instead provide tax relief or energy price relief through lump sum financial support. So far, it's what I wanted to provide to this discussion, and of course, just as a footnote, really, what I've said about energy prices, high energy prices, and a way to go about that in the context of a supply crunch and poverty alleviation similarly goes for high food prices, where similar mechanisms are at work. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Frank, for the explanation about how the climate change, how the environment will definitely have some impact on government policy. So later on today, we're going also to talk about the measurement, how the MPI measurement integrating the environmental issues maybe can be used to make a better policy or can help a policymaker. So thank you very much, Prof. Frank, for your presentation. So we'll be back with you during the Q&A session. So we're going to move to our second speaker, Dr. Desi. So Dr. Desi will address the question, how do corporates report the environmental impact of their policies? So we're going to talk about more about the private sector. So how can we see this dimension? How can we see these measures from corporate report, and what changes need to be made so it can be useful for policymakers, and how can the awareness of the importance of taking into account this environmental impact can be increased? Okay, thank you. Dr. Desi.
Okay, thank you, Ibu Yuli. Can you hear me clearly? Yeah. Okay, good. Good afternoon, all participants. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the role of corporate sector. Yeah, so maybe this is the continuance of the what Professor Frank has said before, that we need also to take multidimensional or multi-perspective, yeah, not only from macro and microeconomics policy, but also from the corporate or private sector. Okay, dear committee, please share my slides. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I will talk about actually I provide maybe the title, yeah, for profit or planet, yeah, the role of the corporate environmental report. But before we continue with the talk, we need to understand the key concepts because my background is in accounting, especially my research areas is in sustainability accounting and how the impact of the policies on women, for example. So it will take into account the gender perspective too, yeah. So we know that in sustainability, we can talk about environmental aspect and also social aspect. And in accounting perspective, we differentiate between the performance and reporting. So what we will discuss today is about how the corporate sector report their initiatives in environmental aspect, which even though the social aspect is not really our focus today, but of course the environmental aspect will also have the impact on social aspect, as we know that the multidimensional poverty can also take the forms in the lacks of awareness in environmental aspect. Okay, next. Yeah, so I will present some findings from research, either from myself or also from students in the graduate of accounting in FEBUI. Yeah, so the first about the reporting aspect, we can see that we can observe some kind of the poor disclosure or poor reporting from corporate sector. So we cannot really know whether the performance is really good as it depicts in the and it is depicted in the reporting. Yeah. So the first indicator is on the readability issue. Yeah. So from from my own research, which deals to answer the research question, what is the current level of readability of sustainability reports of public companies in Indonesia? So we find that, Okay, so yeah, before we discuss about the findings, we can differentiate about the motivation. Yeah, we can differentiate the motivations of the corporate sector, whether it is for value relevance or to opportunistic. Yeah. So if we look at the theoretical perspective from the value relevance, then it focuses on the economic value relevance of voluntary disclosures or reporting. But for the opportunistic behavior, this is I can say that this might be the dominant view, yeah, or dominant findings in the research about environmental report. Because it relates to the management obfuscation hypothesis. So it means that maybe the corporate reporting at current state does not really represent the corporate initiatives in environmental aspect. Okay, next. So from our research, we can know that the reading is rating of sustainability reports published by Indonesian companies are low. Yeah, so it has a low readability, and we can assume that we can interpret the result that maybe there are some initiatives that have not been done by the companies, or maybe it only the initiatives to take impression, yeah, from the users of the financial statement or from the sustainability reports. Okay, next. And the other findings, we also find that there is mimetic isomorphism. So this is another factor. Yeah? So it means that the company just try to mimic or just to copy what has been done by other companies, and has not really tend to create their own initiatives how to tackle climate change or the other challenges of environmental aspect. Of course, there might be one or two winners in these games, yeah, but we cannot observe the pattern in the whole samples. Yeah. Okay, next. Yeah, so we bring the implications of this research that the socialization is needed for professionals involved in the preparation of sustainability reports, be it from the company itself or from the consultant, for example, to really measure, yeah, the corporate initiatives in the environmental aspect that will be represented in their environmental reports, such as sustainability reporting. And then another implication is the need to develop true best practices in terms of readability. Yeah, next. Okay, another example is from our students' research. Next. Yeah, this creates another debates in the national context. Yeah, whether financial performance drive environmental disclosures and environmental costs, because usually we tend to portray the opposite relations. Yeah, whether the environmental disclosure will drive the financial performance. So from our findings, next. Yeah, our findings show that there is no positive relationship on the financial performance, the impact of financial performance to environmental disclosure, but there is positive relationship of financial performance to environmental cost. So we can see there are several implications from this result, yeah, that companies utilize the asset efficiently to fund environmental activities expenditure. So maybe this is a micro perspective, yeah, maybe from the country level or micro policies that will be talked by the other experts later. We can see another aspect how the companies or other sectors implement or adopt the policies into their budgeting or costing aspect. Yeah. Okay, next. Yeah, and another critical point I would also like to point out this is the research from 2020, so it's quite current. The influence of firm size on the ESG score, corporate sustainability ratings under review. So it means that this paper or this research tried to give warnings for all of us, yeah, that the high ESG score can be driven by the firm size. So it means that the big firms tend to have source of funds or source of resources, yeah, many resources to create the impressive reporting, and it might not represent the true initiatives in environmental or sustainability in general. Okay, next. Yeah, and then because we also in the COVID-19 pandemic situation, we also would like to interpret or take the COVID-19 pandemic as a genuine indicator, yeah, because we hope that during the COVID-19 pandemic, maybe there will be the increasing awareness on environmental aspects, so environmental awareness on the corporate sector. But again, we do not see any increasing environmental awareness. So we interpret that the business sectors, especially in this Sharia sample companies that we took as the samples, they still do the business as usual. So it means that the COVID-19 pandemic does not really trigger the needs to increase the environmental awareness. Okay, next. Yeah, so the overall conclusions are, next. Yeah, so we have the hope and the reality here. Of course, this is not a pessimistic position, yeah, but we all have to see that the hope is that companies will do less harm, and then investors and consumers will reward strong performers, and we also need rigorous metric and more sustainable form of capitalism. But the reality that we still see reporting is riddled with problems. Yeah, sustainable investing is overhyped. Environmental threats continue to mount, even though there are several improvements in sustainability initiatives and sustainability reporting, and inequality continues to grow. Yeah, next. Okay, so a better approach to tackle this problem. So this is, of course, this is not an exhaustive list. Yeah, so we can add more. But maybe we can think of better metrics, and also the stakeholder pressure is needed to advance sustainability, stronger civic engagement, sharper regulation and standard at this current situation in the global and also in Indonesia. We are still developing the sustainability standards. Yeah. And then we also need different incentives for investment and rethinking of what makes a company or society successful. So it is not only for profit, but also for planet. Yeah. Okay, next. Okay, and then for research itself, we need a critical look, method, theories, and also for practice, we need an advance a more genuine approach instead of business as usual. And we need integrated thinking, system and strategy, for example, how we can adopt or implement a more controls, yeah, for instance, by exercising levers of control instead of just levers of control. Yeah. And then more importantly, to save planets and people, not only profit, but also prosperity for all. Yeah. So we know that there is the updated triple bottom line. Next. Yeah, so we do know that there is people, planet, yeah, and then the profit, but we also can add or maybe replace the profit with prosperity, yeah, with the tools of sustainability, which are not aimed at only achieving the measurements to satisfy the measurements or the index, but really represent the true conditions or true initiatives taken by the company. Okay, next. Yeah, okay, I think that's all. Thank you, Bu Yuli, and all participants. Look forward to the discussion too.
Thank you very much, Dr. Desi, for the very interesting explanation. So from Bu Desi's talk, we understand the role of private sector, right? So basically, when we talk about data, then there will be some data provided by the private sectors, by the companies. So companies also have this market-based incentive to provide data about environment and how can those data can be used to make regulation. So it's something that we can think about, and maybe we can, answer that question during the Q&A. So basically, how the private sectors can also contribute to this measurement, to this environmental welfare. Thank you, Dr. Desi. So we'll move forward to our third speaker today, Dr. Frank Vollmer. Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, great. I haven't got a chance to say hi to you. So hi, Dr. Frank. It's great having you here, and sorry for the delay. So I think we have this. we have the same question for you and for Dr. Herizo, which is basically what are the indicators? Because now we are talking about the environment, how it is important, but now how can we measure it? If we want to make policy, how can we integrate these environmental factors by having like the valid and reliable measures? And I think you will talk about integrating these environmental factors into the multidimensional poverty measurement and how it will be used later in supporting both macro and microeconomic policies. So time is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. I believe I shared the slides yesterday, and we will be able to see them. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak in here as part of this very important panel. I'm also very happy to be following two of the presentations so far, because they already have been picking up on some of the points that I will be making. So if we can start, please, with the next slide. How to integrate environmental indicators into poverty measures pretty much speaks to what has been known the poverty environment nexus. Right. So the question is, obviously, and Professor Yotso has been picking up on it, climate change is underway, environmental deprivations are underway. Within the poverty environment nexus, this is known to be the biggest challenges, so to say, of the 21st century. So if we're going back to the Stern report on the economics of climate change to 2006, 2009, it was already highlighted that poverty and climate change are the two greatest challenges of the 21st century, and our responses to them will define our generation. And because they are linked to each other, if we fail on one, we will fail on the other. And such statements or such sentiments are frequently heard over the years, both in policy and in academia. Most recently, in a commentary by colleagues of ours in World Development, highlighted again that some of the greatest social challenges are to alleviate poverty and to reverse global environmental change and to find ways of supporting this through research and measurement. And I think these calls are justified. If we're just looking at recent figures concerning multidimensional poverty, we've seen from 2021 that 1.3 billion out of the 5.9 billion living in developing countries are multidimensional poor. And the IPCC report, already being mentioned by Professor Yotso, has highlighted that in regions that have high vulnerability to such environmental occurrences such as floods, droughts, and storms, human mortality is more likely, 50 times higher than in areas where such regions face lower vulnerabilities. And referring to some of the literature also, which was already mentioned, we find that there is a disproportionately large impact of environmental degradation on the poor. A lot of that work stems from the Ecosystem Service for Poverty Alleviation literature, with many use monetary understandings of poverty and then the impacts on the environment. Next slide, please. However, in the recent years, we've seen greater acknowledgement, greater technical abilities, not only to measure multidimensional poverty, but also to understand better, trace better environmental degradation, be it no less with satellite data imagery, where Hiritho will be able to speak quite a bit about it. And regarding measures that are already out there that have started to integrate environmental deprivations, there are a few to mention. For instance, the Green or Sustainable Human Development Indices, the Ecological Threat Register, the Global Living Planet Index, Vulnerability Indices, or a recently published Rural Multidimensional Poverty Index from OPHI and the FAO. And how far, though, environmental deprivations are included, some with geospatial data, some other without household data, depends often on the purpose of the measure. So if you're thinking about rural areas, you're thinking about deprivations, environmental deprivations that affect rural populations in particular. So if we're thinking about integrating more comprehensively environmental degradation into an MPI or enhance an MPI with environmental deprivations, and by doing so, maybe using non-traditional data from household service, we need first to think about certain principles. Next slide, please. So how could this be done? So over the course of the day, we've heard that in principle, a poverty measure shows deprivations poor people suffer at the same time, at the same period. So in a way, we obtain a snapshot of people in poverty facing several deprivations. In situations where you want to integrate or augment an MPI with environmental data, you need to include them. So with regard to the same people actually facing at the same time as the poverty deprivations. So you need to integrate this within the snapshot. So you need to find the snapshot and you need to integrate the environmental deprivations within that snapshot. The second step would require then to look for, identify, justify indicators to include and to judge them based on the possibility to define correct deprivation cutoffs. Next slide, please. So a good starting point, particularly with MPIs that are kind of designed for comparisons, like Global MPI or others, is to use the SDGs. There's a lot of inspiration there to see how you could augment an MPI with life on land, life below water, sustainable cities, and so forth. And this is a slide of two, because I'd like to distinguish indicators that are mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals and can be used quite well to define deprivation cutoffs. So for instance, we can look at air quality, we can look at storms, we can look at fire, and we look at earthquakes. Those are indicators where deprivation cutoffs are more easily justifiable based on, for example, international standards. For example, with air quality, outdoor air quality, you're able to use WHO standards, which were recently updated in 2021, that an annual average concentration of fine particulate matter should not exceed 5 micrograms per cubic meter air. So you have a clear guideline, and you could use that to define your cutoff. Similarly with storms, you can measure storms, you can classify storms, and then you can operate with that. In instances where you don't have such international standards, you still have the possibility to use empirical work, empirical tries, and what has been mentioned as normative reasoning. For instance, when it comes to fires, you can understand where are wildfires recorded, how many are recorded, what is the prevalence in slash and burn practice in the area, and based on this, you can operate with a number of trial measures and justify a certain deprivation cutoff. Next slide, please. But obviously, there are more indicators that potentially could be included. That concerns forest cover loss, soil erosion, precipitation that can cause either droughts or flooding, temperature, biodiversity loss, both in sea and on land. Now, concerning those indicators and those familiar with the SDGs and others, we'll see that there are less international standards and greater challenges, so to say, by finding a deprivation cutoff that can be defended. So, for instance, forest degradation is measured at the national level, and many countries don't do so or have gaps in the reporting. So, when you want to compare, this is a little bit of a limitation. Another concern is that there are direct links to human welfare and indirect links to human welfare. An example at hand is precipitation and temperature, where you can have a direct impact on human welfare by flooding, through much rain, or life-threatening heat waves, as we have seen earlier this year in India or currently in Europe. But then there's also the strong indirect link with, for instance, food security. And Professor Josse already mentioned that. If you have below normal rainfall during cropping season or higher than average temperatures during the harvest season, these are the times where you want to take a look at these indicators and think of cutoffs. But it is a challenge. But giving this type of data inventory, it allows us now to start thinking about ways to augment an NPI. Next slide, please. This is work that I present on behalf of Sabina Alkaya, Hirito, Adrian Drassana, Alex Fortash, and myself, where we're working on environmentally augmenting the global NPI and apply this in Madagascar. We're making the case that we would want to see a direct measure of human poverty that integrates environmental deprivation as a constituent component. And we're justifying this with a multi-sense capability approach. The criteria we're using to augment the global NPI are similar, with an environmental dimension, are similar to those that underpin human poverty. So it should be human-focused. It should have a focus on basic capabilities that should support a decent life. It should support life, like breathing, or when there's capability failure, that this is a threat to it. Types of indicators should be similar to the global NPI, which we've heard. We are looking at outcome indicators, functioning indicators, and so forth, with similar data. And very much importantly so, able to disaggregate by regional level, rural, urban, and to observe changes over time. Next slide, please. So when it comes to household level data and satellite image data, there are certain assumptions to be made and certain decisions to be taken in order to justify the same snapshot that we're looking at. So the global NPI looks at the household level. So at the satellite image, you need to decide on the cluster level. So you need to decide on a radius of cluster where deprivation takes place, and you need to justify your decision to decide if everybody in that cluster is deprived or not, if a deprivation occurs. And we are saying in the paper, or making the argument in the paper, that all households within the same cluster, be it 10K or 10 kilometers or 50 kilometers, are deprived if a deprivation occurs. So the deprivations are defined as follows. Regarding air quality, the annual concentration should not be higher than 5 micrograms per cubic meter air. with a 10K radius. With regards to forest cover loss, this should not be greater than 10% within a 10K radius. A cyclone, particularly important in Madagascar, if there was a cyclone reported within a 50K radius, the deprivation criteria is fulfilled. If 3 or more fires were recorded in a 10K radius, or an earthquake occurred with a strength of or magnitude of 4 or more. Once we decided on that and applied it, next slide please, in Madagascar, we detected in some 3 major findings. First off, when you include the environmental dimension into the global MPI, poverty is increasing by the headcount ratio, by the incidence of poverty, the percentage of the population deprived, classified as poor. That means the environmental MPI uncovers or makes visible deprivations faced by the poor. The second observation is that we find what we are calling equivalent intensity. That means, although the people experiencing greater poverty intensity with the global MPI, the difference is not as pronounced enough or can be explained by the dimensional structure of the measure. This means we have augmented the 3-dimensional MPI, global MPI, with the fourth dimension. Finally, the geographic shape of poverty changes only marginally. Almost all, namely 9 of the 10 poorest subnational regions of the global MPI are also the poorest according to the EMPI, although some rankings change. And we're, next slide please. And we're able to track quite well the results with the geospatial data and how far the results are driven. So we were finding in the time span 2008 to 2018 that air quality has deteriorated quite a lot. Forest cover loss is noticeable and wildfires have increased. These happen at different points in the country, but very well can help to understand what are the drivers of these changes. Next slide, please. So a couple of points that needs to be considered in addition to your, to let's say these standards and kind of technical points. Anybody who wants to do such an endeavor. Exposure to environmental deprivations can be classified often as covariate shocks. So earthquake cyclones. And it was already highlighted, Professor Yotso, that coping strategies matter quite a bit. So we need to be aware that this could be still included, or not in this endeavor, but it needs to be considered. Questions about should environmental deprivations solely be measured by satellite imagery are important. There are some deprivations that happen on the commute or outside of the household or on lands. How can you catch that? Obviously, satellite imagery, how can it guide human welfare policy? We have the assumption that all households within a cluster are either deprived or not. Is that a just assumption which is worth to debate? Deciding on radios can be a challenge. There's less international guidance here. We are combining more frequent environmental deprivations with regard to fire or air quality than others, cyclones or earthquakes. So there needs to be a policy debate, as well as on the severity. Next slide, please. And this is the last 2 slides. We also need to be aware that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity regarding environmental issues. Exposure to environmental degradation differs not only by region, but also by rural-urban, although that can be an empirical question. But usually, or in general, poor air quality is an urban deprivation. Coastal cyclones hit coastal areas, wildfires in particular, strongly affect rural populations. So the question of whether or not indicators should differ is on the plate. And how far you're able or not to identify absolute cutoffs with temperature and precipitation is another point to further investigate. How environmental hazards hit certain occupation groups more than others is worth a debate. And clearly missing values is something that we need to be clearly aware of, because if there's no data on clusters and you have to drop it, you're losing quite a bit of information at the household level. So to combine, last slide, please, to conclude. I think it's vital to integrate environmental deprivations into a measure of multidimensionality directly, but it needs to be in addition to reported separately. It gives you a stronger overview of policy implications and abilities to communicate so, related both to poverty and environmental costs. However, standards apply, so if you want to make policy salient comparisons, they must be robust to different choices of parameters and statistically significant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Frank, for the very interesting presentation. So now we've heard about the EMPI, which is something new after we heard, all the discussion today, and now we heard about the EMPI, which is probably the more recent measurement, right, Dr. Frank? So it's open for discussion, but before we start the Q&A session, so I just want to remind everybody who's following through Zoom, you can post your questions or comments on the chat box. So I'll read the question and comments during our Q&A session. For those of you who are here, you can ask directly, and I will probably I'll explain the questions for those who is in the Zoom if it's not that clear. So I think we can move to our fourth speaker, Dr. Herizo. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, great.
Can I share my screen, please?
I'm sorry? Okay.
Can I share my screen?
Okay, yes. So probably Dr. Herizo will answer the same question that's related to EMPI, similar with Dr. Frank. So let's just hear the last presentation from Dr. Herizo. Time is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not sure if can you see my screen? Okay, great. I think you can see my screen. It is a great pleasure to talk to you today about integrating environmental data into a multidimensional poverty measurements to support macro and microeconomic policies. My name is Herizo Ndianandasana. I'm from Madagascar. The plan of my talk is going to be, I will give a bit of introduction, and I will talk about the environment data that should go into the MPI and how did we do it. And I want to talk a little bit about the interaction between people and wildlife, and also a bit about integrating conservation and development approach and the lack of effectiveness assessment in general, some of a potential data, and also at the end I will give some recommendations towards improved macro and microeconomics policies. First of all, as you know, natural resources provide a lot of ecosystem services to people, and this is related to the principal roles of the natural resources, of the forest, and on marine resources, the role of production, the role of protection, the role of regulation, and the cultural roles. And we can see that poverty often causes people to put higher pressures on the environment. However, wealthier people do not always live in good environmental conditions. And that means we really need to consider a fourth dimension of MPI, which is the environment, if we want to better understand the scope, linking in poverty and the environment. As you know, the calculation of measurement of MPI so far is based on 3 dimensions: health, education, and living standard. And these have 10 indicators. So the goal is to understand if there are extra indicators, environmental indicators we can add as a fourth, to be part of the fourth dimension. So which environment data to incorporate into the MPI measurements? My colleague Frank already showed you, listed the data we use in our paper. But so he talked about the air quality, the forest cover, the fires and the storms, etc. I believe we can also use the VIRS light data from NASA, a very good resolution, especially for the G20 countries. And there is also the migration world pop data, quite good, 1 kilometer resolution. And flood and also the IUCN deadly species, I think they are important. We couldn't really include them in our paper, but I think these are very important data that need to be considered. So what we did was, if you look at the blue dots on the left hand, the map on the left side, these blue dots are the clusters and the grapes where the household survey was carried out in Madagascar. So what we did was, around each cluster, we used the Python command in ArcGIS to draw buffer zones every 5 kilometers, 5, 10, until 50 kilometers around each of them. So we had, for example, in 2008, we had 600 clusters. In 2018, we had 800 clusters. So we developed these buffer zones, 10 buffer zones for each cluster. That means thousands of polygons. And then we ran correlation analysis to see which of the buffer zone is most associated with the changes of the indicator. And then as soon as we identify the most associated buffer zone, for example, the map on the right side, in the right, it is showing, for example, the buffer zone showing around forest for 5 kilometers. And we can calculate the forest cover within each circle of within each buffer zone for each of the clusters. So that is how we calculated the forest cover. And same for fire. If you look at the map on the left, that map indicates the active fires from the MODIS data. And this is free as well. And you can get it for free by email from Maryland University from the US. And you can calculate the number of active fires within each buffer zone. And in the map in the right hand side, this is showing the cyclones. This is based on the tropical storm data. And you can calculate the number of cyclones that pass through each circle, each buffer zone. That means the number of cyclones experienced by the households within the cluster. So I think that can show you rapidly how it works. And this last map is showing the air quality. Frank told you about it. So what is the quality of air based on the concentration of the fine particulate matters experienced by the household within the cluster. And the map on the right-hand side is showing the number of earthquakes. So that is showing you that the integration of the environment data in the MPI measurement is based on a geospatial analysis. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I wanted to talk a little bit about the high interaction between people and wildlife. And I really want to show you these camera trap pictures taken by my friend, my colleague Sam Mason. He was in Mena Bay dry forest. That is one of the most important protected areas in Madagascar, in western Madagascar. And he was there to study that species on top right, which is the Fusa, that is our largest carnivore. And when he was there, he installed 69 camera traps within the Mena Bay forest, which is about 100,000 hectares. And he saw many species, a lot of biodiversity, and he was quite surprised to see quite a lot of feral cats taken by his cameras. And that indicates that there are lots of houses nearby and there is a high interaction between people and wildlife. And he could witness, most of his cameras could witness the overlap between where the feral cats goes and the natural habitat for lemur, and this cat is now attacking the lemur, and that is very bad for wildlife conservation. And many of his cameras also detected people. So people is part of the criteria that we need to consider. And as I said, natural resources provide a lot of services to people. I took this picture a few years ago in Mena Bay, and look at this man. He is very happy. He is holding this basket full of wild yam from the good quality forest. So that means it is important for local people to have the forest in good condition. And one of the things I wanted to talk about is the integrated conservation and development approach. It has been an approach adopted. It has been adopted since 1980s in order to provide direct benefits to local people living around the protected areas. And what we have learned after spending many years in the field is that in terms of conservation actions, local people would accept to collaborate only if they understand the benefits. And for example, there are 144 protected areas in Madagascar, and most of them are managed by NGOs, international NGOs and local NGOs. That means they depend on international funding. But the thing is that all of them are running and have to run development activities, providing clean drinking water, fixing the roof of the school, giving agricultural materials in order to improve people's well-being. And about 70% of the protected areas are managed under the category 5 and 6 of the IUCN. So IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So 5 and 6, the category 5 and 6 requires the involvement of local communities in the management process. So the takeaway message from this slide is that local people must be integrated in the management and monitoring process. I was just, I just wanted to top up a bit the data. So some of the potential data can be the cost. We need to consider the cost of development actions and conservation actions by region or by district. I know in Indonesia, you have more marine protected areas than terrestrial protected areas, but I think it would be important to look at the cost of conservation by district or by region, the number of NGOs intervening in each locality, in each district or region, and the amount of government support received at the district level. And at national level, I believe it is important to look at the annual international financial support by subject. When I say by subject, I mean for education, for infrastructures, for schools, or for so on, for public health. So so far, it is really hard to mitigate the anthropogenic threats. So people are practicing slash and burn agriculture. There is the illegal exploitation of rosewood, and people grow maize and peanuts within the strict conservation zones, and jobs are created, and people, including the migrants, they can make money by growing maize and peanuts. And I was curious a few days ago. I looked at the 2020 global database on protected area management effectiveness, and I was so I learned from that report that only 15% of the countries have met the target of assessing management effectiveness across 60% of their protected lands and waters. And globally, the management effectiveness assessment has been conducted across only 18% of the area covered by protected areas. In fact, I think these figures are quite low, and we need to work harder to understand the management effectiveness. So my recommendations for microeconomics policies would be promoting the use of EMPI. I think it is the way to go. So we need to promote it at national and regional level. We know that it's already at international level. And I would encourage the governments and multilateral organizations to promote the community-based and citizen science approaches that will enrich the monitoring and also link it to awareness raising and enhance decision making at all levels of resource management. And for microeconomics policies, I think it is important to empowering local communities to sustainably manage and monitor their own environment and their society. So when, for example, when there is a household survey, they need to be integrated, they need to understand and look at them. They smile, they listen to instructions, and also they are open to tell what they think. So as long as we can build trust with them, we can develop transparency, they would be interested to collaborate and reduce the anthropogenic pressures. I also think it is important to reinforce the participation of women in conservation and development activities. This includes mainly the revenue generating activities for them to get some financial benefits. And also I know many countries, especially in the G20, already making a lot of effort in this, but I think it is good to emphasize that it is important to intensify ecological restoration that promotes conservation, and also we should target profitable economic sectors, for example, cash crops or mangroves or crabs or anything, part of that ecological restoration. So in conclusion, I think it is very important to come up with a robust concept of EMPI integrating relevant environment data. And each protected area should identify the main economic sectors that should lead to motivation of local people to save wildlife. I'm insisting about protected areas because I understand that most of the important conservation zones would already be part of the protected areas. They will have protected areas status. And we could see from the talk this afternoon that there are many available spatial data that can be used to support the calculation of EMPI, and they are free. Everything I showed today, is free. You don't need to pay. And if possible, I would suggest that the G20 hold a session about the EMPI in the next meeting, or maybe in regular meetings. And if possible, I would propose the use of EMPI within the ongoing development of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. That ends up my talk. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Herizo. That's a really interesting presentation, adding more understanding to the EMPI. So I think we can go to our Q&A session. We already have one question posted on Zoom from Siekto Diko. So the question is for Dr. Frank Vollmer, but Dr. Herizo, you can definitely jump in if you have anything to add, because this is about the EMPI. So Dr. Frank, the question is, when we construct MPI, we need to decide on the deprivations in the environment. Is that sufficient if we say that people live in low air quality as deprived or poor? I'm not sure if people living in the area is poor. They could be, but maybe sometimes they don't. Second question is regarding the environmental phenomena itself. I don't understand how do we take the environmental phenomena like forest loss, which is the coverage is area, but applied in the household deprivations. I mean, it could be that environmental effect did not affect the individual deprivation status. Can you please elaborate on this issue? Okay, Dr. Frank, time is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Yeah, very good. Two questions. To answer the first, is it sufficient if you live in an area with bad quality air to be poor? No. The simple answer is no. I mean, if you recall the Multidimensional Poverty Index, it measures poverty over a number of indicators grouped in several dimensions, and each indicator gets a certain weight. And in the three-dimensional structure of the global MPI, for example, where we have 10 indicators, you need to be deprived in a critical mass of indicators to be classified as poor, and that's 33.3%, 1/3 of the 10 indicators in the global MPI. What we've done in the EMPI is to increase the number of indicators from 10 to 50 and also group it in 4 dimensions. So that means that the weight to be multidimensionally poor lowers across the indicators from 33% to 25%, the equivalent to 1 dimension. And each indicator within the environmental dimension gets 1/5 of that weight, of that dimension. So if you're deprived just in air quality and in no other indicator, for example, you will be non-deprived. You will not be poor. You will not be poor. You will be deprived, but will not be poor. An example where you could think of is you would live in a household that suffers of no deprivation in any of the 10 indicators of the global MPI. But it so happened that you live in an area, in a cluster where there's poor air quality, where there were more than 3 fires recorded, where there has been a cyclone in the last year, by accident an earthquake, and eventually also not sufficient forest cover, which is 10% in our measure, then yes, you will be multidimensionally poor, because you will have deprivations that add up and sum up to 25%, sufficient to be called multidimensional poor. So I hope that answers it. So it needs to be more than just the deprivation in one indicator to be classified as poor, both in the global MPI and the augmented environmental MPI. With regards to forest loss, recall that we are looking for the same snapshot. So we need to have the same people. If we augment an MPI that is at the household level, we need to identify the same households. When we apply the data, the geospatial data, and what Riso did, and we're looking at forest cover and forest cover loss in particular, then we need to apply a certain radius, a cluster radius, and that can be 5K, 10K, 50K, and more. So based on certain trial measures we've done, we decided on 10K radius and said it should not be, it should be at least a coverage of 10% available. So within a 10K radius, whether you're in a city or in a rural area, you need to have some access to forests. for various reasons, for many ecosystem services that forests provide, provisioning, for example, but also recreation activities and so forth. So that is certainly an assumption within the EMPI that we put forward, and further research of these implications are ongoing. But we believe it's a fair assumption to think that if you don't have that access, it does impede, so to say, your human welfare. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Dr. Herizo, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I will have a tiny addition about the, the second question, like how the forest laws affect the household. I can give you some examples. For example, people rely on timbers, on fuel and on charcoal and on wood for building their houses. If there is very low forest cover within the radius of 5 kilometers, people would struggle. They will spend more time to find the wood. They will not. So that means if there is tiny forest left within that radius of 5 kilometers, they will struggle to find the wild yam, as I showed in my slides. So no food, less food, no fruit, and less medicinal plants. Many people still rely on medicinal plants, and that is one of the most important services provided by the forests. And also, there are also some cultural aspects. Many tombs and many graves are still in the forest. So if the forest is destroyed, they will feel upset, and many papers are already written about the link between forest cover and mental health. So that is related to connectedness between people and wildlife. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Herizo. For Mr. Siaktio, if you have any other question, you can post it on the Zoom chat. I'll move to the second question. So the second question is for all of our speakers. It's from Henning Wikan. Putting sustainability and environmental issues alongside the energy sector needs a lot of resources, financial, human resource, and knowledge. So do you think the design solution will be more practical to be implemented in the Asian area? Maybe cement the regional level instead of focusing on national level such as Indonesia. So what do all the speakers think about this? So maybe we can start from Dr. Frank Zotzo.
Yes, very happily. Look, in terms of mobilizing the required finance, for example, for the energy transition, both national and international approaches need to be taken. We tend to think of governments really as needing to play a big role here, but governments really ultimately are largely merely the facilitators of these investment flows. It will be private investors that really provide the money. Traditionally, much of these kinds of investments, many of these kinds of investments are funded domestically, but many of our countries in the G20 are in fact capital importers. That goes both for Indonesia as well as Australia, where I live and work. And so, the international dimension here is important as well. We have many international bodies that can help in that regard. And really the main point I would make with regard to the G20 is that in this time of rising economic nationalism and a greater focus on keeping supply chains domestically controlled, investing at home rather than abroad and all of this, it is really important for the G20 countries to keep committing, actually, or to recommit to open investment and trade frameworks. Because to mobilize the enormously large amounts of money that will be necessary for the clean energy transition, will require for those investments to be made efficiently, and that includes to make them in the countries where they are most productive, and that's not always the countries where the capital is abundant. So we need open investment regimes. We need to be able to facilitate cross-national investment flows, and individual governments ultimately have an important role in that to keep the borders open for these investment flows.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Dr. Desi, do you have any take about this?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Yuli. Thank you, Bu Henning, for the question. Yeah, for the corporate sector, either corporate level, national level, regional level, and international level supports are needed to integrate or to support the energy transitions towards the more clean energy, for example. Yeah. And of course, if the corporate are left alone, they will always think about the cost and benefits because the energy transitions or putting or integrate the sustainability into the business will require a lot of resources. And as I have mentioned before in the slides, that we also need the stakeholders' pressure. So it's not only about the regulations or about the some kind of support from governments or from the any kind of rules or standards, but we also need to empower the stakeholders from, for example, the local people, yeah, and also I think Dr. Herizo mentioned it before, yeah, because it is also needed to educate, yeah, to educate the civic and increase the civic engagement together, so that the regulations at all level, we call it the multi-governance perspective. Yeah, so it's not only at the corporate level, national level, but we also need the international and also the regional level. As in the accounting, we also adopt the global or international financial reporting standards, and we now also would like to adopt the international sustainability standards with all the debates still around regarding the adoption, but it shows that not only the national support, but we also need the regional and also international support to hand in hand with the civic engagement and the empowerment of the stakeholders to give more pressures to corporate sector. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Desi. Okay, Dr. Frank Vollmer, maybe you have any take on this issue?
Yes, thank you very much. Just very brief. MPIs, national MPIs, in many instances have been used for planning and budgeting purposes. And the work that we're proposing here in Madagascar is something that can be learned from and possibly applied in other circumstances, obviously also Indonesia and elsewhere, where it then brings together such elements as sustainability, environment, and energy. So there's already indicators included in the global MPI, for example, and many national MPIs on energy with regards to access to electricity, access to clean energy, and so forth. So there's work to be done, and there's usages of such tools in order to coordinate better and plan better across the various departments or the various governmental bodies. And I believe that it's a contribution to solve this complex challenge that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. And Dr. Herizo, you talked about the international support before. Maybe you have some addition to this issue?
I was mute, sorry. Yeah, not very much, but one thing I would like to say is people in developing countries really struggle to use the solar energy or wind energy, or because it's too expensive to start. So, they can use a very small tool for charging battery for radios or anything, but not really for lighting people's houses. And one other thing is when we talk about sustainability, one thing we should consider is the carbon offset, for example. But that should be a sustainable way of, helping people, especially those who rely on natural resources. Unfortunately, that is not very obvious until now, and also the cost of CO2 emission, ton of CO2 emission is quite low in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Herizo. So do we have any questions from the floor? Yes. Go ahead. I can hear you well, but I don't know about everybody in Zoom.
So my name is Ken. Hello, my name is Ken. I'm a Jardine Scholar from the University of Oxford. So I think Dr. Vollmer has touched a bit on it about EMPI, but my question is, could you clarify more on what exactly can you see more from EMPI as opposed to two separate multidimensional poverty index or a multidimensional environmental index? And continuing from that question then, if you were to make a policy, how would you prioritize and give weightings towards EMPI, MPI, and just an environmental index? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ken. And the questions for Dr.
Sorry, it's either to Dr. Vollmer or Dr. Anian Rasama.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ken. Thank you very much. What do you see? I think, as we have presented, or as I've presented, I think on slide 2, there are emerging indices that are integrating environmental deprivation, sustainability indices, for instance, into the measurement of poverty, but as a comprehensive poverty index where environmental degradation is a constitutional element of it. No such endeavor has been undertaken. So we believe we're moving ahead on those elements where more comprehensively you're able to incorporate various indicators as regards to a direct deprivation to human welfare. So it's not a little bit of a snapshot. It's actually with 5 indicators quite comprehensive, and I believe with further research, you'd be able to even incorporate more, which allows you to better see the environment as a constituent element of poverty. So when we debate poverty and the poverty environment nexus, it truly comes in that sense together. That being said, it's only complementing the existing work so far. So it doesn't mean that it overrides poverty analyses based on national MPIs or global MPI or even on other poverty environment nexuses. But it is an additional tool that allows us to close the picture and bring it together, not only in the realm of research, but also in the realm of policy. Again, an MPI brings together policy tools. We've heard it from talks earlier today by Michelle and others, where it's been used and where it helps to really open a venue of conversation. And I think what direct policy can be based on such debates, it could reach from resilience, giving examples with regards to cyclones or earthquakes. You try to strengthen the resilience of certain environmentally prone areas. You try to plan ahead. You try to already try to help to think about coping strategies. So there are some clear examples. We can also learn from things that are already happening in the field. And we hope and think that by bringing it together in one index, it brings more attention to it and makes it more visible.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. Dr. Herizo, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, maybe I have a tiny addition on top of what Frank said. I think Frank is correct when he says this is additional to the existing global MPI. And the question was really interesting. What I can say is, so far we have 10 indicators based on the global MPI, and now we have we are suggesting to have extra indicators. For example, in our paper, we use 5 extra indicators that will be part of the dimension, environmental dimension. But the goal is not to, what is that? So in terms of analysis on top of we will keep using the GMPI, but on top of that, it is important to look at the level of poverty by considering those environmental indicators. What we saw, for example, is that when we added these environmental indicators, people are poorer than we thought. You know, what is it? And it is really tricky because when you ask about policy, what would be the policy? For example, should the government provide more support to the areas that were battered by cyclones? Should the government provide and the NGOs provide more support to the areas that presented higher forest loss? That is tricky because so far we are supporting the areas that manage to protect their forest as a sort of incentives, sort of, you know, to motivate them to keep going and conserving the forest. So we are still there, and you know, our next plan is to run some deeper statistics analysis, running, for example, generalized linear mixed effect model, looking at the contribution of each indicator on the level of poverty in general, and that will tell us more about what sort of policy will be actually needed. And I agree, it will be really hard to get the identical 5 environmental indicators for all of the countries, because it might depend from country to country. Maybe cyclone is very important in the tropical areas, but not in the temperate areas. So it depends. So forest loss is probably very important in Africa, but not so much in the G20 countries. So I think we need to wait a little bit before we can provide substantial policy. But what I can recommend today is that I think EMPI is the way to go. I would suggest that the G20 would discuss it in the next meeting. Maybe they should have a session about it. And I think it is really important to look at poverty from the other angle in order to address the issue of poverty environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hariza. Mr. Ken? You have addition? Okay, great. Anybody else on the floor has questions for our panelists? If not, then maybe we can conclude this session with just like one question for all of our speakers. Given the existing data, I mean, like Dr. Harizo, Dr. Vollmer, you talk about, you know, EMPI as an alternative solution, but there's still like questions about like data that can be used to measure the reliable data to be used to measure EMPI. So maybe my question will be to all of our panelists, given the current, you know, the existing data, what advice you might want to give to governments in terms of using these environmental issues, environmental related data in making policies, given, you know, the current data limitation. Maybe Dr. Frank Zozzo, you have any take on this?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be very brief in response to that. And that is really to say, increase the base of reliable data. And so for the topics I've been talking about, climate change and energy, it's really survey approaches that are quite suitable for increasing the informational basis for policymaking. we know a lot about energy consumers, behavior, and so forth, but it's hard to go wrong investing in additional information, particular survey-based, detailed surveys on energy use, energy expenditure. And we know very little about climate change-related aspects. So we hypothesize and we use anecdotal evidence, we use various specific research studies to understand climate change exposure and risk, including in the context of poverty, but there's very little solid statistical information available, and that is a gap that needs to be plugged.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Frank. Dr. Desi, you have any take on this?
Thank you, Dr. Yuli. Well, in terms of the, I discussed first from the corporate sector perspective, for the corporate sector performance in environmental and social data, because it relates with the investors' needs, then there have been several indicators to measure the corporate performance. For example, from the ESG data, for example, that will be used by the stakeholders, especially the investors, to as a guidance to allocate their investments or resources. And I think that if the EMPI, the EMPI data can be spread to the maybe at the national level or and reach the corporate level, maybe it can also become the guidance for the corporate to make the as the guidance for them to make the investment in CSR or something like that, in sustainability activities or sustainability incentives, so that they can put the resources or allocate the resources towards the areas or towards the people who really have the environmental deprivation as measured by the EMPI. So that's the data can do both. Can be useful either for the corporations and also for stakeholders. That's from my take.
Thank you, Dr. Desi. And for Dr. Frank Vollmer and Dr. Herrizo, this might be related to EMPI, right? Because Dr. Herrizo mentioned about maybe G20 need to talk about this, right? But there's like some maybe limitation in the data. So what will be your suggestion? What will be the caveat that you might want to stress to government who want to integrate these environmental issues into their policies? Dr. Frank Vollmer?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I echo what Professor Yotsu was saying, the way that we need to increase the informational basis, by while doing so, we need to be aware of continuous, let's say, rules that apply, generally speaking, to MPIs with regards to robustness and statistical significance. So we are exploring at the moment, we are proposing, we are discovering. In terms of budgeting or certain things, there are same rules apply with the EMPI, then it applies to national MPI. So you need to be doing so with a very good, robust base. And if you don't see that, or if you don't have that, it might help you to coordinate your activities, but you should be more cautious then in order how to use it. But this is an avenue we do explore, we do make we make it very transparent and very visible. So I believe with that knowledge in mind, it can help to design policies or at least debate good policy avenues to explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frank. And Dr. Herrizo?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think 3 points. One is, I think we need stronger collaboration between conservation managers and development, conservation NGOs and development NGOs. They need to have stronger collaboration in the field because they work, because it is clear now that their work is complementary, so they should work together. I don't really have that impression so far. So that complementarity. So it's not about competing for funding or competing for reputation, but we should work together, and we should reinforce the collaboration, especially in the field at local level. The second point I would like to make is, as Professor Frank said, access to information, and also we need to allocate higher budget to the Ministry of Environment, so that they can address most of the issues based on environmental deprivations in each district or in each locality. That would help a lot, in my opinion. And the last one is, as I said, there is the ongoing development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And they have 291 indicators there. Maybe we should check, maybe through the T20, we should, the T20 Task Force, maybe we should check if we can suggest some indicators to go into that post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in order to set an EMPI, and now is the time to do that because it is ongoing, it is an ongoing process. And finally, maybe COP27 would be, I think, by the time that COP27 will come, we'll have more robust and better understanding of how MPI works. And we will have more information about what policies we will need in terms of implementation. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to contribute to this session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hariza. So with this, we conclude our session. Let's give a round of applause to all of our panelists today. So thank you very much, Dr. Frank Zotso, Dr. Desi, Dr. Frank Vollmer, and Dr. Harizo. I think we learned a lot, and we're looking forward for a better measure of poverty by integrating environmental issues. Thank you very much for all the attendance. With this, I'll close this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Honorary speakers, dear participants, thank you for the invitation to this important event on multidimensional poverty. Poverty reduction is one of the biggest and most important challenges of our global community. I have personally said as my vision that tackling poverty and climate change are, or at least should be, the most important goals of politics in our lifetime. Environmental crisis and poverty are linked. People with lower incomes living in poorer circumstances have only a small impact on climate change or biodiversity loss, but they suffer most from the impacts. People living in poverty have less possibilities to adapt to environmental crises. This spring and summer we have witnessed extreme heat waves, for example in India and Pakistan, that have caused immense human suffering and even death. This is just the beginning of what we will face due to an accelerated climate crisis. We are faced with triple crisis: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Nature loss is happening right in front of our eyes, around the world, also in my home country, Finland. Every 9th species in Finland and half of our biotopes are endangered. For addressing climate and nature crisis, we know this is not only an ecological issue, but more and more also a health and economic issue. It is an equity and justice issue for today's most vulnerable communities as well as future generations. It is about food security, about epidemics and pandemics, about access to fresh drinking water, and about rising sea levels that threaten coastal human habitats. And most of these happen in countries that are not responsible for the majority of emissions caused. Nor have they had a chance to enjoy the prosperity that many of the richer nations have achieved through polluting the planet. Finland continues to underline the need for an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which sends a clear message with regard to sustainable development, ecological prosperity and well-being to all. Focusing on the drivers of biodiversity loss and using the best available scientific knowledge is vital. Pressures on nature and thus also towards human health are intensifying. For our common goal to halt and reverse the biodiversity loss by 2030 and beyond, and for making meaningful progress, new forms of cooperation, knowledge and innovation are required. Additionally, we need to strengthen the understanding of the vital interlinkage between food systems and biodiversity loss. For example, we rarely think that the value of pollinators is measured in tens of millions of euros only in Finland if we consider that humans would be paid to do the same work. Globally, this amount is astronomical. Indeed, pollinators and insects are a good example of how important it is to mainstream the protection of nature into agricultural policies and the link to pesticide pollution. The Finnish government approved in 2021 a new report on development policy across parliamentary terms, which relies on a human rights-based approach and includes biodiversity conservation as one of the main objectives and as a cross-cutting theme. This means that biodiversity aspects need to be taken into account in all Finnish development financing, and that more funds will be directed to protecting biodiversity. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all of us, and it's clear that after it we cannot return to business as usual. As we are building back, we need to be building back better for the environment and for a more equal society. These kinds of changes in society create an opportunity for a transition towards a more sustainable future. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the importance of protected nature areas in Finland were extremely important for people. Last year, we had over 4 million visits in the 40 national parks of Finland, a growth of more than 20% in a year. This is a high number considering that there are only 5.5 million inhabitants in Finland. Science has shown us that even short visits in diverse nature lower stress levels and blood pressure. The health benefits of nature are indisputable. That is why we need to make sure that visiting nature and green areas is possible for everyone and everywhere. It should never be about money or possibility to travel far away from home. I warmly welcome the goal of the European Union Commission to increase the green areas in cities and bring nature closer to people's everyday living environments. Protected areas can also generate significant economic benefits for local people as well as nationally. The total income and job impacts of all the 40 national parks in Finland in 2021 were over 300 million euros and about 2,500 jobs. A national park can easily double the economic activity in the surrounding area, like for example in Hossa National Park that was founded in 2017 in southern Finland. The input-output ratio of the national parks is good. When Parks and Wildlife Finland invests €1 of taxpayers' money in the hiking services of national parks, the local economy benefits over €10 on average. By involving all stakeholders, business, academia, and implementing the whole of society approach and intergenerational equity, I am confident we can find new forms and measures to minimize harmful impacts on biodiversity. We need more nature than we have now. Nature-based solutions, when properly implemented, are cost-effective and offer multiple benefits for nature, the climate, and humans. For example, through the expansion of nature reserves, restoration of peatlands, or through greening cities, battling with heat. Over 90 countries have together stressed that at least 30% of land, inland waters, and sea areas should globally be taken into protection by 2030. National biodiversity strategies and action plans are the main tools in putting the global biodiversity framework into practice and to boost implementation. At the same time, it is important to strengthen compliance and monitoring mechanisms under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Professor Partha Dasgupta has brought the attention of the world on internalizing biodiversity into decision making. His report provides one important framework for connecting the greatest ecological crisis of our time to their drivers, to the overuse of national resources. We have a common responsibility to make sure that future generations will also have an opportunity to enjoy the human right to a healthy environment and global equity. A nature-positive world will require that we build a nature-positive economy. Reforming our economic systems to operate within planetary boundaries requires a collective effort. For example, we are in Finland developing a system for accounting ecosystem services. Accounting ecosystem services is important because we need to be able to track our natural capital. Ecosystem accounting gives us an opportunity to see how the quantity and quality of our ecosystems and the services they provide change over time. It could also help us to measure better how the different ecosystem services benefit people with different economic status. When making these services more visible and countable also globally, this could give a stronger incentive to create better ecosystem services for the people in vulnerable positions. Climate change and biodiversity loss are interconnected crises. To ensure the impact of our actions, we need to tackle these issues simultaneously. It is also our responsibility in countries with high consumption and high living standards to do more, since our wealth has been built up with the unsustainable use of fossil fuels. We need to take faster action to stop the climate crisis. And I'm proud to be able to tell you that Finland's new Climate Change Act entered into force at the beginning of this month on the 1st of July. The reformed Act sets emission reduction targets for 2030, 2040 and 2050. This means that the target of a carbon-neutral Finland by 2035 has been set down by a law, as well as our commitment to be carbon negative soon after that. Finland is actually the world's first country to make a legally binding commitment to carbon negativity. These targets are based on our Climate Science Panel's assessment of what is consistent with our commitment under the Paris Agreement to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Act ensures that greenhouse gas emissions decrease by at least 60% by 2030 and by at least 80% by 2040 compared to the 1990 levels. In addition, national adaptation measures are taken to promote climate change resilience and management of climate risks. The Act also ensures the prerequisites for the Sami people to maintain and develop their own language and culture. Solving global environmental issues is vital for equality and ensuring good living conditions for people all around the world. As I often say, if we don't find solutions to the environmental crisis we are facing today and in the future, all other policies are useless, since we don't have a future without a livable planet. I hope that we could show that Greta Thunberg was wrong when she said that we will not understand it until it's too late. Tackling poverty together with the climate crisis and biodiversity loss are the most important challenges of our time. The best time to act was already yesterday, but the second best day to start doing more is today. And as Greta wisely put it, the moment we decide to fulfill something, we can do anything.